Michelle and Edgar met in their first year at university, and they immediately developed a close friendship. Michelle thought she was lucky because it was not always possible to meet such a perfect person in a lifetime. Common interests, the same sense of humor, an outlook on life, all this was great. But the only thing that spoiled the perfect picture was Edgar's girlfriend. Michelle saw that the young couple were not as emotionally close as she and Edgar, so she just quietly waited for them to break up. And soon it happened. But before Michelle could get overjoyed, Edgar began to change girls one after another. However, even then, Michelle calmed herself with the fact that Edgar just needed to have some fun, and in time he would finally realize everything and definitely see in her not just a true friend, but a woman. 6 years passed. One day, a group of former classmates gathered to celebrate the new year. They remembered funny stories from their student life, joked, discussed common acquaintances. Michelle even thought it was not such a bad idea to celebrate the new year together, especially since Edgar was here too, although he came with his girlfriend, but he still paid a lot of attention to Michelle. One of the guys, drunk enough, asked Edgar suddenly, "Admit it, do you love Michelle?" "Well, yeah, for 6 years now. And luckily for us, we only have a spiritual closeness. She and I are the closest people. It's so much more valuable than a one-time affair, and there's no way we're going to ruin it. Don't you agree, Michelle?" Michelle smiled tautly and nodded in agreement. But then an unfamiliar man suddenly stepped into the conversation. Michelle had been catching his interested glances all evening, but tried not to pay attention. He was about 10 years older than everyone else here, and Michelle had never seen him in their company before. "It sounds like you're afraid to start a normal relationship and hide yourself behind a friendship between a man and a woman, which doesn't exist in the world. Or maybe one of you is deceiving the other by deliberately hiding his feelings. Michelle and I are proof that you're wrong," snorted Edgar. The stranger smirked and asked what they were doing as friends. Hearing back that Edgar and Michelle hung out, went to the cinema and cafes, and shared everything to each other, he asked, "Do you tell each other about your love relationships too?" Michelle had a lump in her throat at those words. Of course, she had never discussed her boyfriends with Edgar, simply because there were none. All her thoughts were on Edgar alone, and she didn't see the point in letting anyone else get close to her. "I told you, we are discussing everything. And anyway, what do you care about us?" Edgar began to get angry. "Michelle is a beautiful and interesting woman, and I am attracted to her, so I'm trying to figure out if she's single." Laughing, Edgar advised the man not to even try, since he thought he was too old for Michelle. And then he suddenly suggested asking Michelle if she would go on a date with such an insolent man from nowhere. The people around her began to whisper, and suddenly Michelle felt the need to teach Edgar a lesson for being so careless about her feelings. "Why not? I'll go. Goodbye, everybody," she said unexpectedly to herself, and quickly got dressed and ran outside. Michelle walked away, barely holding back her tears. She bitterly thought that all these years she had wasted her time on Edgar, expecting him to pay attention to her as a woman. Suddenly she heard someone call out to her. Michelle turned around sharply and saw the recent stranger. He probably walked right out behind her, and she didn't notice. "Oh, it's you. I'm sorry for giving false hope. I don't have time for a date." "I understand that, but perhaps you'd like to accompany me for the next 2 hours? This is my first time in your city, and I wouldn't want to celebrate the new year alone," the man said, and nodded meaningfully toward the nearest restaurant. And then Michelle remembered that it was almost midnight, and she did not want to stay outside on New Year's Eve. In addition, she felt guilty that she had disrupted the man from his place, and so she agreed. Fortunately, there was a table for them right away. The man introduced himself as Brandon. He was 34 years old and had come to the city to open a branch of his company. The quiet confidence he radiated confused the woman for some reason. They talked nicely, and after the chime of the clock, they went their separate ways. Only when she was at home, Michelle remembered Edgar for the first time. She checked her phone and saw several messages from her friend. Edgar asked if the new acquaintance had done anything bad to her. He also made a few snide remarks about his age, and finally, concluding that the stranger was not at all suitable for Michelle, asked her to write as soon as she would be home. Michelle decided that if Edgar had texted, it meant he was worried and maybe even jealous. She had already started typing a message when suddenly she noticed a notification about Edgar's new post in the social network. When Michelle opened it, she saw a picture with him passionately kissing his girlfriend. Michelle realized that now she would spend the rest of the weekend sobbing inconsolably, mourning for her unhappy love. But fortunately for her, she could not sink into sad thoughts for long. In the morning, her boss called and asked her to go to work for an important client, and Michelle agreed with pleasure, thinking it would be a distraction. But when she saw this special client, she was greatly surprised. "Brandon, how did you find me? Don't tell me this is all accidentally?" "Not too bad, but it is a coincidence. I really need a professional help. I'm looking for an apartment for myself. Find me those options that you would choose for yourself. I don't think my opinion will help you. I don't like apartments and would rather live in a suburban house." The man hummed, and after thinking for a while, demanded to see all the houses and apartments their company was selling. Michelle had never had such a demanding client before. In a few weeks, they toured all the properties, and Brandon showed real business acumen, which greatly delighted Michelle. He was asking the owners many questions, revealing the problems that they didn't even know they had. Finally, he chose a cozy house in an elite suburb not far from the city. Michelle was delighted. The house was perfect, and she herself had dreamed of having such a one. After the dinner, celebrating the completion of the deal, they had the conversation that Michelle had been dreading. Brandon offered to drive her home, and Michelle could not refuse him. After all, he had paid very generously for her real estate services. Parked near the entrance, the man turned to her. "Michelle, I'd like to start courting you." Michelle laughed and tried to joke back. "Brandon, it's like you're from the previous century." "Michelle, let me be clear right away. My intentions are more than serious. When I was young, I was no better than your frivolous friend, so I didn't build a long-term relationship with anyone. But now I'm going to fix that, and I want to build a strong family. If you're still hoping that sooner or later you and Edgar will get together, then we shouldn't start. So think carefully. We haven't even started dating, and I already have to decide whether I would like to have a family with you," said Michelle indignantly, and jumping out of the car, quickly walked to the entryway. Michelle could not understand how they could, not even knowing each other, to talk about family and marriage. So, once home, she wrote a refusal to Brandon, but something stopped her. She calmed down a little and decided to think everything over in the morning with a clear head. And next, Michelle suddenly decided to make a revision of her feelings for Edgar. At first, she made a list of their common interests and realized that most of them were not to her liking at all. She was spending a lot of time watching Edgar's favorite games, but she never launched the console herself without him. She hunted down tickets to heavy rock concerts just to spend a few hours with him. All of this and more she decided to cut out of her life. After that, Michelle was able to switch to things that interested her. After signing up for yoga, French lessons, embroidery, and archery classes, she moved on to the hardest part. Armed with a bottle of wine, the girl began rereading all her text messages from Edgar. For the first time, she realized that he was never truly interested in her and always talked only about himself. Michelle forbade herself to be offended by the guy. She occupied herself with new hobbies, and gradually, her thoughts about Edgar ceased to evoke her former feelings. She soon became convinced of this by inviting him to a cafe. Michelle looked at the love of her life and wondered. She didn't like the way Edgar ate, the way he talked, the way he looked. She could not explain why she had suffered for so many years because of that pompous man. Michelle hurried to finish their dinner early and ran out into the street. For the first time in a long time, she felt really free and realized that she could start a new relationship. After a moment's hesitation, she texted Brandon, asking where he was going to take her on a first date. The answer came quickly. "You were taking too long to answer. Now it's up to you to decide where you're going to ask me out. Oh, and just in case, I don't like sweets, but meat chops will melt my heart. The girl smiled, assured him that she would consider his wishes, and in a joyful mood went to the store. She had several more days to learn how to cook meat chops. On their honeymoon, Michelle and Brandon went to Cyprus. Michelle admired everything she had seen around her and enjoyed the start of married life until one day she woke up to the sound of a message. It was Edgar. "How's the newlywed doing?" "Apparently well, since you've ignored my last 20 messages. I need to talk to you. Leave your old man for 5 minutes." Michelle frowned, quietly got out of bed and went out onto the balcony. She saw that Edgar had been texting her for hours in a row and realized that he was just drunk and hadn't found anyone around to talk to. And so it turned out. "How's life with your pensioner?" asked Edgar. "Better than with a teenager like you. Is that the question you wanted to ask me?" "Well, don't get mad. I'm just worried about you. I'm afraid he'll get bored with you soon enough, and he'll put you at the stove and give you a vacuum cleaner while he gets a mistress for himself." Michelle thanked Edgar for his concern and told him not to judge everyone by himself. Edgar, realizing that she got angry, decided to change the topic of conversation and asked to share her impressions of her vacation. Michelle softened a little and fulfilled his request. She was absorbed in conversation and did not notice that Brandon was standing nearby. He immediately understood with whom his wife was chatting and simply asked why it was so urgent to do it the night. Michelle said that they were just talking, and as far as she could remember, her husband said that he was not against their communication. "Michelle, everything has a limit. You're not respecting yourself by doing this. And if I do the same and start texting some ex-girlfriend at night during our honeymoon, would you be pleased?" Michelle looked at the situation through her husband's eyes. She became very ashamed of herself and answered honestly, "No, it will be very unpleasant for me. I've understood everything. Please forgive me." 3 years passed. During this time, communication between Michelle and Edgar was reduced to a minimum, and soon the guy announced that he was going to get married. He chose a girl from a wealthy family. A few days before the celebration, Michelle came to the wedding rehearsal. "Are you happy with her?" she asked Edgar. "Who cares? All women are the same anyway." "If I should marry, at least to the richest one," said Edgar lazily. "What's wrong with that?" "You did the same thing," he added, seeing the surprised look on Michelle's face. "I just can't believe it. You, as always, judge by yourself. Remove me from the guest list. I'm going home." And Michelle hurriedly left. On the way home, she kept replaying the recent conversation in her head and was inwardly indignant. She knew that she sincerely loved her husband, and no one had the right to say otherwise. 30 minutes later, Edgar called. He apologized and tearfully asked to meet her. Michelle changed her anger for mercy and went to the address, but when she saw that it was a hotel, doubts filled her head. Despite a bad feeling, she went up to the room. Edgar opened the door and, without a word, grabbed Michelle and began to shower hot kisses on her. The woman felt dizzy and she could hardly find the strength to push him away from her. "Why now?" she asked, almost panting. "Michelle, I've realized that I've been an idiot all this time. I love you, and I always loved you, but I didn't understand it to the end. Will you give me a chance?" Michelle urged Edgar to come to his senses. "The two of us need to calm down and think about everything. I have a daughter and a husband, and you have a fiancé waiting for you. I don't love her. I want only you. I'll cancel the wedding and marry you." Michelle looked at the man she once loved and shook her head. "And if I refuse, will you marry her as if we never had this meeting here?" "Come on, of course. I'll call off the wedding anyway." "Really? Have you told her already? Or were you going to tell her during the ceremony?" Edgar got nervous and tried to convince Michelle that he was just in such a hurry to see her that he hadn't had time to tell his future wife everything, but he would definitely do it. "Yeah, that's so mature and in your style. Well, good luck to you." "I need my family," said Michelle, and walked out of the room. She walked home and cried at the thought that because of such a miserable person, she almost made a terrible mistake. At home, Michelle did not hide anything and immediately told her husband everything. She prepared herself for his condemnation, but Brandon only smiled in response. So did Edgar finally confess his love for you? Yes, and I'm morally crushed at the thought that the man I'd loved for years turned out to really be irresponsible and rotten. Will you forgive me? If you admit that I was right about friendship between a man and a woman, Brandon said and winked at Michelle. Michelle nodded and kissed her husband tenderly. Later, when Michelle was already asleep, Brandon reread the reports of the guards who had followed her and Edgar. He thought for a moment and instructed him to stop Edgar if he ever came near his wife again. He was glad that Michelle had made the right decision, but he didn't want to risk his marital happiness one more time. 10 years had passed, and Michelle and Edgar had never seen each other. She knew from mutual friends that almost immediately after the wedding, which he never canceled, a terrible scandal broke out. Tired of Edgar's endless cheating, his wife filed for divorce. Michelle was glad that the story of her first love ended with only barely noticeable nostalgia.